The night of December 31st, 192 AD, Rome did not mourn. When the news spread through the streets of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known, that the emperor was dead, that the man who had called himself a god had been strangled in his own bath by his personal wrestling partner, the Senate did not gather in grief. There were no public tears, no official silence, no performative sorrow from the men who had spent years applauding a ruler they privately feared and openly despised. There was relief, the kind of relief that only arrives after a very long and very dangerous wait. And that reaction, that collective exhale of an entire civilization finally free from something it could not name out loud, is the most honest portrait history has ever produced of what 12 years of Commodus had done to Rome. Not the battles, not the administrative records, not the official accounts written by men who knew that honest words about living emperors had a way of becoming last words, but that silence, that absence of mourning for a man who had inherited the most powerful throne in the world from the most admired emperor in Roman history. This is not a story about a bad emperor. Those exist in abundance, and history preserves them with the casual indifference of a civilization that had seen enough of them to stop being surprised. This is a different story. This is the story of what happens when a human being receives everything: power, wealth, name, legacy, and has built absolutely nothing inside himself to carry it. When the armor is magnificent and the man beneath it was never asked to become anything. When the gap between who you present to the world and who you actually are becomes so vast, so structurally unsustainable that not even absolute power over millions of lives can fill it. Marcus Aurelius spent 58 years building something that most human beings never build at all. A character consistent enough to survive the most extreme conditions that power, loss, and responsibility can create. He governed plagues. He led wars he didn't want, from frontiers he never left, in a body that was failing while the empire still needed everything he had. He buried 9 children. He watched the man he shared power with waste that power on pleasure and spectacle. And every night, in cold tents on the edge of the world, with the weight of the day's decisions still in his body, he sat alone and wrote to himself about how much he still needed to improve. He did all of that, and then he handed everything to his son. What Marcus Aurelius saw in Commodus, what he documented with the same surgical precision, he applied to his own failures. What he watched forming with the specific helplessness of a father who understands exactly what he is seeing and cannot change it, is perhaps the most painful thread running through the final pages of the Meditations. Not the philosophy, not the stoic principles rehearsed and refined over decades, but the quiet, devastating awareness of a man who had spent his entire life learning to govern himself, watching the person he loved most in the world show no interest in doing the same, and choosing to name him emperor anyway. That decision, what it reveals about the limits of wisdom, the limits of love, and the specific kind of loss that arrives when you do everything right and the result is wrong anyway, is where this story truly begins. Because Commodus did not become what he became in a single moment, he became it across a lifetime of small choices, small surrenders, small moments where the easier version of himself was available and the harder version asked for too much. The same choices that are available to every human being alive today. But before we go further, before we enter the full story of what Commodus did with what his father built, and what it reveals about power, character, and the most dangerous gap that exists inside any human being, I need to stop here for a moment. Not for protocol, not because this is the part of the video where engagement is requested, but because if you have made it this far, if something in these first words landed in a way that felt less like history and more like recognition, that already tells me something important about you. Most people would have left by now. Most people consume content the way they consume everything else in the modern world, quickly, partially, always half present, always half somewhere else. You stayed. You let the questions do their work. And that specific quality of attention, the willingness to sit with an uncomfortable idea long enough to actually feel its weight, is exactly what separates the people who learn from history from the people who are condemned to repeat it. So I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever watched someone you loved or respected or believed in make a choice you knew was wrong and felt completely powerless to change it? Have you ever been in the position of Marcus Aurelius, seeing clearly what was coming, understanding exactly what the signs meant, and discovering that understanding is not the same as being able to stop it? Have you ever done everything right and watched the result be wrong anyway? If you have, write it in the comments. Not the full story if you don't want to give it, just the words, "I saw it coming and couldn't stop it." Because that feeling, that specific and very human experience of clarity without control, is at the heart of everything this video is about. And when you write it publicly, something shifts. You stop carrying it alone. You connect with thousands of other people who sat in the same position, felt the same helplessness, and are still trying to make sense of what it means to act with integrity when the outcome refuses to cooperate. The comments on this channel are not a performance space. They are where the real conversation happens, where someone who needed to read exactly what you wrote will find it at exactly the right moment. Marcus Aurelius wrote alone at night for no audience. And 2,000 years later, his words are still doing the work that honest words do. You don't need 2,000 years. You just need one comment, written with the honesty this story deserves. And if this kind of content, real history, real psychology, real questions about power and character and what it actually costs to be the person you decided to be, if this is the kind of conversation you want to keep having, then hit the like button now. Not for the number, because that gesture is how you tell the algorithm that depth has value. That content which asks something real of the people who watch it deserves to reach more of them. Every like on this video is one more person who will leave here asking the question Marcus Aurelius asked himself every night, and that Commodus never asked once. And if you are not yet subscribed to Mind Masters Academy, subscribe now and activate the bell, not out of habit, but because what is being built here is a series that does not work in isolation. Each video is a piece of a larger conversation about the minds, lives, and decisions that most shaped how human beings understand power, character, and themselves. Commodus only makes complete sense after Marcus Aurelius. And what comes after Commodus? A story involving a document buried for 1,700 years and the man history condemned as the ultimate traitor will only make complete sense after this. The thread connects, but only for those who stay. There is a specific kind of silence that only arrives after something that should have ended much sooner finally ends. Not the silence of grief, not the silence of shock, but the silence of a breath held for so long that the body had almost forgotten what it felt like to exhale freely. The silence of people who had been waiting, in private, in whispers, in the careful language of men who knew that honest words about the wrong person had a way of becoming last words, for something they could not ask for out loud. That was the silence of Rome on the morning of January 1st, 193 AD. The night before, in the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, a man had been strangled in his bath. Not by an enemy, not by a foreign invasion, not by the kind of dramatic political conspiracy that history tends to romanticize with the distance of centuries. He had been killed by Narcissus, his own personal wrestling partner, the man he trained with, the man whose physical presence in his life was supposed to represent strength and loyalty and the intimate trust that exists between people who share the discipline of the body, sent by Marcia, the woman who shared his bed. Coordinated by Ecletus, the man who controlled access to his most private spaces, approved by Latus, the commander of the very guard whose entire purpose was to ensure this exact thing never happened, the people closest to him, the people who should have had every reason to protect him, the people whose lives were structurally bound to his survival. They decided together in careful silence that the world would be better without him. And when the Senate gathered the following morning and the news spread through the corridors of Roman power that Commodus was dead, that the 12-year reign that had begun with such inherited promise and descended into something that Rome's collective vocabulary struggled to fully describe was finally over. What happened was not mourning. What happened was the political equivalent of that exhale. Senators embraced in the streets. The name of Commodus was struck from public inscriptions with a speed that suggested the tools had been ready for some time. The Senate issued a formal condemnation of his memory, damnatio memoriae, the official erasure of a man from the record of history, with a unanimity that left no room for ambiguity about how the people closest to power had truly felt about the power they had been living under. Rome did not mourn. Rome celebrated. Quietly, carefully, with the restrained relief of a civilization that had learned, across 12 years of increasingly unpredictable rule, that visible joy at the wrong moment could still be dangerous. And that reaction, that collective and immediate absence of grief for the death of a sitting emperor, is the most honest historical document that exists about what the reign of Commodus had actually been. Not the official records, which were written by men navigating the perpetual tension between truth and survival. Not the biographies composed decades later, filtered through political agendas and the comfortable distance of retrospect. But that morning, that silence that was not silence, that relief that Rome allowed itself to feel before it had even confirmed the official version of events. Because here is what that morning reveals, that no biography fully captures, the thing that makes the story of Commodus not just historically significant, but personally urgent for anyone paying attention to the world they actually live in. Commodus did not arrive at that bathtub suddenly. He did not wake up one morning as a functioning emperor and go to bed that night as the man whose own inner circle had concluded he needed to die. The distance between Marcus Aurelius handing his son the greatest empire in the Western world and Narcissus wrapping his hands around that same son's throat in a bath on the last night of 192 AD, that distance was not crossed in a single step. It was crossed across thousands of small moments, thousands of small surrenders, thousands of individual instances where the version of Commodus that could have existed chose, consciously or not, the version that was easier, more immediately satisfying, more consistent with a psychology that had never been genuinely challenged. Power did not corrupt Commodus. That framing is too simple, too convenient, too comfortable in the way it places responsibility outside the individual and onto the circumstances that surrounded him. Power revealed Commodus. It removed, one layer at a time, every external structure that had been containing what was already there. The ego without foundation, the identity without substance, the human being who had been given everything and built nothing of his own because nothing had ever demanded that he build it. And this is where the story stops being about a second-century Roman emperor and starts being about something that lives much closer to your own life than ancient history has any right to. Think about the people you have known, in professional environments, in positions of institutional authority, in the smaller but no less real hierarchies of family and community, who, when given power, became something that felt less like a revelation and more like a confirmation. Something you had sensed was there, beneath the surface, before the position arrived to remove the surface entirely. The colleague who became a manager and discovered, in that transition, a version of themselves they seemed to have been waiting for permission to express. The leader whose competence was real, but whose character, once the external accountability structures were removed, proved to be something different from what the competence had implied. The person who, given the room to expand without resistance, expanded in directions that harmed everyone in proximity. You have seen this. Most people who have spent any meaningful time inside organizations, relationships, or systems of any kind have seen this, because the pattern Commodus represents is not an anomaly of ancient Rome. It is one of the most consistent and most reliably recurring patterns in the entire history of human behavior. The gap between performed character and actual character revealed the moment circumstances stopped requiring the performance. Marcus Aurelius understood this gap with a precision that the Meditations document on almost every page. He understood it in himself. That was the entire point of the diary, the entire reason he wrote alone at night with no audience and no editorial filter. He wrote to close that gap, or at least to prevent it from widening, to hold himself accountable to the version of himself he had decided to be, rather than the version that exhaustion and power and the accumulated weight of decades of extreme responsibility might have produced if left unexamined. He understood the gap. He worked on the gap every night of his adult life. He built, across decades of deliberate and painful internal work, a character consistent enough to carry what destiny had placed on his shoulders without being destroyed by it. And he watched his son show no interest in doing any of it. Not from stupidity. Commodus was not unintelligent, and the historical record makes this clear enough for any honest reading. Not from a complete absence of capacity. There were moments, especially in the earlier years of his reign, where the infrastructure of competent governance that Marcus Aurelius had built continued functioning because the people who had built it were still in place to maintain it, but from something more fundamental and more difficult to address than intelligence or capacity. From the simple, devastating absence of the question that Marcus Aurelius had asked himself every single night. Who am I when no one is watching? Not who do I need to appear to be, not what does this role require me to perform, but who am I actually in the space between what happens and how I respond, in that interior territory where real character either exists or doesn't, where the work of self-knowledge either gets done or gets avoided, where the person you decided to be either survives the pressure of circumstances or gets slowly replaced by the person circumstances find it easier to make you. Commodus never asked that question, or if he did, he stopped asking it early enough that the habit never formed, the practice never took root, the internal structure that the question builds when asked consistently and honestly across years and decades never developed into something capable of carrying what was coming. And what was coming, what arrived on the morning of his father's death in March of 180 AD, when Commodus was 18 years old and the most powerful empire in the Western world passed entirely into his hands, was everything, all at once. With no gradual increase in weight, no incremental expansion of responsibility, no slow and merciful adjustment period during which a young man might discover his own limits before those limits were tested by conditions that allowed for no failure. Just everything, immediately, irreversibly. And here is what nobody tells you about that moment. The detail that changes how you understand everything that followed, every decision Commodus made, every escalation, every excess, every step in the long and visible descent from inherited promise to the bathtub on the last night of 192 AD. He had been watching his father carry that weight since he was born. He had grown up inside the weight, surrounded by it, defined by its proximity. He had accompanied Marcus Aurelius on military campaigns, had sat in rooms where the decisions being made measured their consequences in tens of thousands of lives, had existed at the center of the most demanding leadership environment that the Western world had ever produced. He had seen all of it. He had been prepared for all of it, in every external and institutional sense that preparation could mean. Every resource, every teacher, every structured exposure to the responsibilities he would eventually inherit had been provided with the deliberate care of a father who understood exactly what his son was going to face and wanted, with everything he had, to make sure the son was ready. What Marcus Aurelius could not give Commodus, the one thing that cannot be inherited, cannot be transferred, cannot be provided by any external structure, no matter how carefully designed, was the internal work. The daily, private, unglamorous, endlessly demanding practice of examining yourself honestly and choosing again and again the harder and more consistent version of who you decided to be over the easier and more immediately available version that circumstances are always offering. That work belongs to the individual. It cannot be done by proxy. It cannot be inherited with a throne. And without it, as Rome was about to discover across 12 years that would leave marks on the empire's psychology long after Commodus himself had been erased from its official record, even the greatest inheritance in the world is just a countdown. There is a particular kind of pain that has no clean name in any language, not the pain of loss exactly, as though loss is inside it, not the pain of betrayal, though there is something of that too, in the specific way that reality betrays the version of it you needed to believe. Not grief in the conventional sense, because the person you are grieving is still alive, still present, still sitting across the table from you, or sleeping under your roof, or carrying your name into a world that will judge both of you by what they do with it. It is the pain of clarity without power, the pain of seeing fully, accurately, without the comfortable distortions that love and hope and the human need to believe in people we have invested in tend to produce. Seeing exactly what is happening, exactly where it is going, exactly what it will cost, and understanding with a precision that offers no comfort whatsoever, that understanding is not the same as being able to change it. Marcus Aurelius knew that pain. He knew it in the specific and irreversible way that only a parent can know it, the way that arrives when the child you formed, the person whose entire existence you feel responsible for, in the deepest and most irrational sense that responsibility can operate, begins demonstrating consistently and unmistakably that the formation did not take in the way you needed it to take. And what makes this particular dimension of Marcus Aurelius's story so rarely examined, so consistently passed over in favor of the more comfortable narrative of the philosopher-emperor whose only real failure was the son he chose, is that he did not pass over it himself. He wrote about it, not directly, not with the explicit naming of names that would have been politically catastrophic and personally devastating in equal measure. But in the meditations, in the entries written during the final decade of his life, when Commodus was already co-emperor and the signs were already visible to anyone paying honest attention, there is a thread that runs beneath the stoic principles and the philosophical frameworks and the carefully constructed language of a man writing for himself rather than for posterity. A thread of a father who knows. The meditations return, repeatedly and with an almost compulsive intensity in their later entries, to a specific cluster of ideas, the limits of what one human being can do for another, the boundary between influence and control, and the discipline required to respect that boundary even, especially when respecting it means accepting outcomes that the heart refuses to want. The Stoic principle that Marcus Aurelius had built his entire internal architecture around, the distinction between what depends on you and what does not, applied not to plagues or wars or the political betrayals of ambitious men, but to the people you love, to the people whose choices you cannot make for them, no matter how clearly you see what the right choice is, no matter how much you are willing to sacrifice to make it easier for them to choose it. He wrote about this because he was living it, not as an abstract philosophical exercise conducted from a comfortable distance, but as the daily, grinding, intimate reality of a man watching his son become something he could not stop and could not fully accept and could not pretend not to see. The historical record gives us enough to reconstruct what Marcus Aurelius was observing during those years with a degree of specificity that makes the reading uncomfortable in the best possible way. Commodus, from early adolescence, demonstrated a consistent preference for the company of people who demanded nothing of him over the company of people who challenged him to become more. He gravitated toward physical spectacle, gladiatorial combat, athletic performance, the arena in all its forms, with an intensity that went beyond enthusiasm into something that looked to anyone watching carefully more like need. The need for a domain where victory was guaranteed, where the rules were simple, where the complexity and ambiguity and moral weight of actual governance could be replaced by the clean and immediate feedback of physical domination. He was, in the language we would use today, actively avoiding the work. Not the external work, the administrative duties, the military responsibilities, the ceremonial demands of the role he had been born into. Those he performed when required, with a competence that was sufficient precisely because the infrastructure his father had built was strong enough to function adequately, even with a distracted hand at its center. What he was avoiding was the internal work, the examination, the daily and unglamorous practice of asking yourself the questions that have no comfortable answers and sitting with what those questions reveal long enough to actually do something about it. Marcus Aurelius saw this. He saw it the way a man sees something he has spent decades learning to see, with the clarity that comes from having looked honestly at the same patterns in himself, having recognized them, having chosen repeatedly to address them rather than accommodate them. He saw in Commodus the version of himself that the meditations existed to prevent, the version that takes the easier path when the harder path is available, the version that lets exhaustion and ego and the seductive comfort of unchallenged existence make decisions that the more examined version would never approve. And what he did with that seeing, the choice he made in the face of that clarity, is the part of the story that most people find the hardest to reconcile with the image of Marcus Aurelius that the Meditations have built. He named Commodus emperor anyway, not in a moment of weakness or denial, not because he had convinced himself the signs were not what they were, or that the transition to absolute power would somehow produce the transformation that 2 decades of deliberate formation had failed to produce. The Meditations do not belong to a man who was good at self-deception. They belong to a man who had spent his entire adult life becoming progressively better at seeing reality as it actually was rather than as he needed it to be. He saw clearly, and he chose anyway. There are historians who read this as the single great failure of Marcus Aurelius, the one place where the philosopher-emperor allowed paternal love to override the rational judgment that defined everything else about his reign. The argument is structurally clean and not without merit. Rome had spent the previous century governed by emperors chosen for competence rather than biology, adopted rather than born, selected with a deliberateness that had produced Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius himself. 4 consecutive reigns that represented the closest thing to enlightened governance that Roman history would ever record. Marcus Aurelius broke that chain. He returned to biological succession, and the result was Commodus. But there is another reading, one that requires sitting with the Meditations rather than just reading them, one that requires understanding not just what Marcus Aurelius believed philosophically, but what he had actually learned across 58 years of living those beliefs under conditions that tested them beyond anything a philosophical text can prepare you for. The other reading is this. Marcus Aurelius understood, with the precision of a man who had spent decades studying the boundary between what depends on you and what does not, that naming Commodus emperor was the only honest choice available to him. Not because Commodus was ready, not because the signs were not what they were, but because the alternative, the selection of a different successor, the bypassing of his biological son in favor of an adopted heir, would have required Marcus Aurelius to act as if he had the power to guarantee an outcome that no human being has the power to guarantee. He had tried to form Commodus. He had given everything that a father with his resources, his wisdom, and his genuine love for his son could give. He had taken him on campaigns. He had arranged the finest philosophical education available in the Roman world. He had exposed him, repeatedly and deliberately, to the weight of real responsibility in the hope that proximity to the weight would eventually build the internal structure necessary to carry it. And it had not worked. Not because Marcus Aurelius had failed as a father, though he would have written that he had, because that was the kind of man he was. But because the internal work, at its most fundamental level, cannot be done by anyone other than the person who needs to do it. You can create every possible condition for someone else's growth. You can remove obstacles, provide resources, model the behavior you hope they will eventually choose, remain present through the failures and the resistances and the long stretches where nothing seems to be changing. You can love with a completeness that costs you more than any battle you ever fought. And the other person still has to choose it. Marcus Aurelius knew this, had arrived at the understanding that the Stoics called acceptance, not passive resignation, not the abandonment of effort or love, or the continued attempt to influence what could still be influenced, but the clear-eyed recognition that some outcomes exist outside the territory of what any human being controls, no matter how wise, no matter how powerful, no matter how complete the love they bring to the attempt. He had done what he could do, he had tried what he could try, and when the moment came, when his body was finally yielding to the illness that had been taking him slowly for years, when the empire still needed a named successor, and the only honest choice available was the one that history would spend centuries judging, he named his son. Not because he believed it would be fine, but because Marcus Aurelius had learned at the deepest level that a human being can learn anything, that the value of a choice does not depend on the outcome it produces to be real. That doing the right thing, the thing consistent with who you had decided to be, remains the right thing even when everything that follows proves it was not enough. There is a word in Latin that Romans used to describe the children born to reigning emperors: porphyrogenitos, born in the purple. Born inside the imperial chambers, inside the physical and symbolic space of absolute power, at the exact moment when that power was at its most concentrated and most unquestioned. Born not into a world that would gradually reveal its demands and its resistances and its capacity to push back against a human being trying to find their place within it, but born already at the center, already at the top, already in possession of everything that other human beings spend their entire lives attempting to reach. Commodus was the first emperor in nearly a century to have been born that way. Think about what that means, not as a historical detail, but as a psychological condition, as the specific and largely invisible architecture of a childhood that shapes everything that follows without ever announcing itself as formative. Because the most powerful influences on who we become are rarely the dramatic ones. They are the ambient conditions, the water we swam in before we knew we were swimming, the assumptions about how the world works that formed before we had the consciousness to question whether they were assumptions at all or simply reality. For Commodus, the ambient condition was this: everything was already his, not eventually. Not after effort, after demonstration of competence, after the slow and humbling process of proving to the world and to yourself that you deserve what you are reaching for. But immediately, structurally, by virtue of nothing more than the biological accident of being born to the right man in the right room on the right night, the palace was his, the empire was his. The armies, the treasury, the political machinery of the most powerful civilization in the Western world, all of it was his, in the sense that it would one day pass to him, in the sense that everyone around him understood this and organized their behavior toward him accordingly, long before he had done a single thing to earn any of it. And this specific configuration of circumstances that looks from the outside like the greatest possible gift that fortune can give a human being, is one of the most reliably destructive psychological conditions that exists. Not because wealth is inherently corrupting, not because privilege automatically produces character failure, or because people born into advantage are condemned by that advantage to become less than they might have been otherwise. The history of human beings who were born with everything and chose to build something real with their lives anyway is long enough and compelling enough to make that argument impossible to sustain. Marcus Aurelius himself was born into Roman elite privilege, was identified early as exceptional, was handed extraordinary resources and opportunities and proximity to power long before he had demonstrated the character that would eventually justify all of it. The difference was not the privilege. The difference was the resistance. Marcus Aurelius encountered resistance from the stoic philosophy that demanded he examine himself honestly and relentlessly, regardless of what the examination revealed, from the teachers who challenged rather than accommodated, from the 20 years of waiting between being identified as the future emperor and actually becoming emperor, 20 years during which he was close to absolute power, but not in possession of it, during which his character was being tested by the specific and irreplaceable pressure of not yet having arrived. And from destiny itself, from the plagues and the wars and the losses and the accumulated weight of a life lived under conditions that did not adjust themselves to his preferences or his limitations, or his need for things to be manageable. Life pushed back against Marcus Aurelius with a consistency and a force that demanded again and again that he become more than he currently was, or be destroyed by what he couldn't handle. Commodus encountered almost none of this. The tutors who surrounded him were men who understood, with the precise political intelligence that survival in the imperial court required, that the future emperor's displeasure was a thing to be avoided rather than risked in service of his formation. The philosophical education that Marcus Aurelius had pursued with genuine passion and personal commitment was, for Commodus, an obligation to be endured rather than a practice to be internalized. The Stoic principles that his father had spent decades transforming from abstract theory into lived discipline were, to the son, words. Arrangements of language that described experiences he had never been required to have, pointing toward an internal territory he had never been required to enter. The resistance wasn't there. And without resistance, something essential in the formation of character simply does not happen. Character is not transmitted, it is built. And it is built specifically through the encounter with resistance, with difficulty, with failure, with the experience of wanting something and not immediately receiving it, with the slow and often painful process of discovering your own limits and deciding what you are going to do about them. The encounter with circumstances that do not adjust themselves to your comfort. The experience of being pushed back against hard enough that you have to either grow or retreat, either develop the internal resources the situation demands or find a way to avoid the situation entirely. Commodus had been protected from that encounter so thoroughly that the interest had never developed. And without the interest, the knowledge remained external. Words and frameworks and philosophical structures that existed around him rather than inside him, that could be quoted when the situation called for quotation and discarded the moment the situation stopped calling for it. He was not choosing the arena because he loved physical competition in the abstract. He was choosing it because it was the one domain in the entire architecture of his existence where the outcome was guaranteed without requiring the kind of internal development that all other domains were beginning to demand. In the arena, he was always going to win, Not because he was the best, but because he was the emperor, and no one in the arena was going to risk their life on the possibility that defeating the emperor's ego might be worth the cost. The arena offered him something that governance, philosophy, military strategy, and every other arena of actual consequence could not offer: the experience of competence without the requirement of actual competence. It was the same psychological structure that had organized his entire childhood, the same elimination of genuine resistance, the same construction of a domain where victory was guaranteed, and the gap between performance and reality could be maintained indefinitely without ever being forced into the light. The signs were visible from the beginning to anyone paying the kind of honest attention that the situation required and that the situation made politically dangerous to demonstrate. The philosophical tutors who had surrounded him since childhood began noticing that their sessions with the young co-emperor had changed in quality. The questions Commodus asked, which had never been the questions of a genuinely curious mind, but had at least been the questions of a mind performing curiosity with sufficient skill to maintain the appearance of engagement, were becoming fewer. The periods of genuine attention were becoming shorter. What had been a performance of intellectual engagement was quietly dropping even the performance. He stopped listening, not abruptly, but gradually, and then consistently, and then in a way that made the gradual beginning seem, in retrospect, like the inevitable opening movement of something that had always been heading exactly here. There is a principle that experienced observers of human behavior tend to arrive at independently, through different routes and different frameworks, but with a consistency that suggests it is describing something real rather than something theoretical. The principle is this: people rarely become something fundamentally different from what they already were. They become more of what was already there, amplified by circumstances, liberated by power, accelerated by the removal of the external structures that had been containing what existed beneath them. Power did not change Commodus, it revealed him. And in 177 AD, when Marcus Aurelius named his 16-year-old son co-emperor of Rome, the conditions for that revelation were finally in place. Commodus was 16, not a child, not in the Roman sense, not in any historical sense that gives that word its modern meaning of incompleteness and protected innocence. 16 in the 2nd century AD was a man, measured by every standard that Roman society used to define the category. A man old enough to lead armies, to make decisions with permanent consequences, to be held accountable in the full adult sense of the word for what he chose and what he failed to choose. What the historical record shows about those first months of Commodus as co-emperor is not a story of gradual deterioration. It is not the story of a promising young leader corrupted over time by the pressures and temptations of power. It is something more precise and more disturbing than that. It is the story of a character expressing itself for the first time without meaningful constraint. The first thing that careful observers noted was not a dramatic act, not a visible abuse of power, not a public display of cruelty or excess that could be pointed to and named. It was something subtler, something that required a certain quality of attention to perceive, but that, once perceived, could not be unperceived. Commodus stopped listening. The second thing that careful observers noted was the company he chose when the choice was genuinely his. Marcus Aurelius had spent his entire reign surrounding himself with people who challenged him. Philosophers who disagreed with his conclusions, advisors who told him things he did not want to hear, generals who pushed back against strategic decisions they considered wrong. Commodus, given any meaningful degree of choice about who occupied his time and his attention, consistently chose differently. The men he gravitated toward were not the philosophers and the experienced administrators and the militarily competent generals that his father's world had been populated with. They were the men of the arena, men around whom he could be without performance or pretense or the exhausting demand to become something more than he currently was, simply the most powerful person in the room. The third sign appeared in how Commodus handled the first genuine political crisis of his co-regency. In 178 AD, Marcus Aurelius returned to the Danube frontier for the final phase of the Marcomannic Wars, taking Commodus with him. What Commodus demonstrated on that campaign was not the emergence of the military competence that the exposure was designed to produce. It was the active, visible, almost aggressive preference for the social dimensions of the campaign over its strategic ones. The banquets over the war councils, the performance of imperial presence over the substance of military engagement, the cultivation of personal popularity among the soldiers, not through the demonstrated competence and shared hardship that had earned Marcus Aurelius the genuine respect of every army he had ever led, but through largesse, through entertainment, through the specific and structurally hollow kind of popularity that arrives not from being someone worth following, but from being someone worth standing near, because the proximity is materially comfortable. He was, in other words, already doing what he would spend his entire reign doing, substituting the performance of power for the substance of it. Marcus Aurelius watched this. He was there. He had organized the entire campaign, in part, as a final attempt to transmit through proximity and direct experience what decades of more formal formation had failed to transmit. And what the meditations written during that period reveal is a father who has arrived, finally and painfully, at the understanding that the transmission is not going to happen. The historians who wrote about this period decades later were not lying exactly. They were organizing the evidence into a sequence that moved more smoothly than the evidence actually moved. They were finding the arc of decline rather than acknowledging the more disturbing truth that the evidence, read honestly and in sequence, actually suggests. There was no arc. There was a character that had been present from the beginning, shaped by 16 years of conditions specifically designed to prevent it from ever being genuinely challenged, expressing itself with increasing clarity and increasing confidence as the external structures that had been containing it were progressively removed. The 16-year-old who stopped listening to his tutors, the young co-emperor who chose gladiators over philosophers, the heir who performed military presence while avoiding military substance. That person was already, in every way that mattered, the emperor who would rename Rome after himself, declare himself the reincarnation of Hercules, and end his reign strangled in a bath by the people who knew him best and had concluded that the world required his absence. Not because power changed him, because power finally stopped pretending he was something he had never been. There is a specific kind of damage that arrives not from what actually happened, but from what almost happened. Not the wound itself. The wound, in a strange and counterintuitive way, can sometimes be processed. Named, located, assigned to a specific moment in time that exists in the past rather than the present, integrated into the narrative of a life with the slow and painful work that genuine healing requires. The wound has edges. It has a before and an after. What almost happened has no edges. It has no before and after in the same clean sense, because the after is simply the continuous present, the unending now in which the thing that almost happened did not happen but remains, permanently and irrevocably possible. The near miss lives in the nervous system differently from the direct hit. It does not produce the specific and locatable pain of the actual wound. It produces something more diffuse, more pervasive, more structurally disruptive to the internal architecture of a person, the permanent and unresolvable awareness that the world is capable of producing the worst thing, that it came close enough to touch, and that there is no guarantee it will not come that close again. In 182 AD, Commodus was 20 years old. He had been sole emperor for 2 years. The inherited infrastructure of his father's reign still largely intact, the advisors and administrators and military commanders who had built that infrastructure still largely in place, the surface appearance of functional governance still largely maintainable by the accumulated momentum of what Marcus Aurelius had constructed over 2 decades of deliberate and disciplined rule. And then, on a winter evening as Commodus was entering the Colosseum through one of its underground passages, a man stepped out of the shadows with a drawn sword. The assassin was Quintianus. What is not debated, what every source agrees on with a consistency that suggests it is accurately describing something that actually happened, is the detail that made this assassination attempt uniquely, permanently, catastrophically damaging to the psychological architecture of the emperor it failed to kill. Quintianus did not simply attack. He announced himself first. He stepped from the shadows, drew the sword, and spoke. Said something to the effect that the Senate sends you this. That what was coming was not random violence, but organized intention. That the man holding the sword was not acting alone, but as the instrument of a collective decision made by people already inside Commodus's world. And then the guards intervened. Quintianus was seized, disarmed, executed. The emperor was unharmed in the physical sense. Not a scratch, not a drop of blood, nothing that the body would carry forward as evidence of what had occurred. The attack had failed before it fully began. But the words had already been spoken. The Senate sends you this. Think about what those words meant to a 20-year-old emperor who had spent his entire life inside a system organized around his centrality and his safety, who had been surrounded from the moment of his birth by layers of institutional protection, specifically designed to ensure that the outside world reached him only in filtered and manageable form, who had grown up in an environment of almost total confirmation, where resistance had been systematically eliminated, where every expression of preference had been treated as a directive, where the gap between what he wanted and what the world provided had been kept artificially narrow by an entire apparatus of human beings whose survival depended on keeping it narrow. For that person, for the specific psychological structure that 16 years of that environment had produced, the attack itself was not the most damaging element of what had just occurred. The attack could be processed as an external event, assigned to a category of threat that the imperial security apparatus was designed to handle. The words were something else entirely. The words said that the threat was not external, that it had not come from outside the walls, from the known and nameable enemies that every emperor faced. The words said that the threat was inside the Senate, inside the institutions that were supposed to be the structural foundation of his reign. Inside the relationships, the carefully maintained, politically managed, externally cooperative relationships with the senatorial class that represented the closest thing that Roman imperial governance had to a system of institutional accountability. Inside, in other words, the very world that Commodus had inherited from his father and had been governing from the assumption, never fully examined, never fully stress-tested, never subjected to the kind of honest scrutiny that Marcus Aurelius applied to every assumption he held, that it was fundamentally, if not perfectly, on his side. That assumption did not survive those words. What followed in the weeks and months after the failed assassination was the visible, external expression of an internal collapse that the historical record documents with enough specificity to allow for something approaching a psychological reconstruction of what was happening beneath the political surface. Commodus did not respond with the measured and strategic calculus that a leader shaped by genuine wisdom and genuine internal stability might have brought to it. He responded from the wound, from the raw and unprocessed and completely unexamined panic of a man who had never developed the internal architecture to metabolize genuine threat. Everyone became a suspect, not metaphorically, literally. The paranoia that descended on Commodus in the aftermath of the Quintianus attempt was not the rational vigilance of a man who had learned from a near miss to be more careful about who he trusted. It was the structural dissolution of the capacity to trust at all, the replacement of a functional, if imperfect, model of the social world with one organized entirely around the premise that the threat could come from anywhere, at any time, from anyone, including and especially the people whose proximity was greatest and whose apparent loyalty was most established. The purges that followed were not, in their earliest phase, the theatrical excesses of a man who had lost all connection to political reality. They were, in their internal logic, almost comprehensible. The desperate and destructive attempt of a psychological structure with no other tools available to restore a sense of safety in a world that had just demonstrated its capacity to produce the worst possible outcome without warning. But the strategy was self-defeating in a way that Commodus, without the internal resources to step back from his own fear and examine it honestly, was constitutionally incapable of recognizing. Every execution increased the pool of potential conspirators among the survivors. Every senator killed for suspected disloyalty produced grieving families, political allies, personal networks that had every reason to become exactly what the paranoia feared they might be. Every advisor removed for the crime of honest counsel left a vacancy filled by someone who had learned, from the fate of the predecessor, that survival required the abandonment of honesty. The world Commodus was trying to make safe was becoming, through the very measures he was taking to make it safe, progressively more dangerous. The paranoia was producing its own confirmation, generating through its destructive expression the actual enemies that its initial fear had only imagined. Marcus Aurelius had spent decades building the pause, had written about building it, had returned to it again and again in entries that described the specific and demanding practice of noticing the impulse before acting on it, of examining the fear before letting the fear make decisions, of maintaining the discipline of distinguishing between what is real and what the mind, under pressure, constructs as real from the raw material of what it most fears. Commodus had none of that. What broke was the appearance of stability, and what remained, what the months and years following the assassination attempt progressively revealed, with the specific and terrible logic of a character finally fully expressing itself in conditions that no longer offered any meaningful constraint, was the actual structure of the man who had been living beneath it. There is a point in the disintegration of a human being's relationship with reality that is different in kind from everything that precedes it. Not just in degree, not simply a further step along the same continuum of deteriorating judgment and escalating excess that the earlier stages of that disintegration represent, but different in kind, a qualitative shift. The moment when the internal machinery that connects a person to a shared and verifiable external world stops functioning in the way that functional contact with reality requires. Before that point, the destruction is comprehensible. After that point, something else is operating. In the mid-180s AD, somewhere between 5 and 8 years into his reign, Commodus crossed that point, and the name he chose for what was on the other side of it was Hercules. Not as metaphor, not as the kind of symbolic identification with a heroic archetype that Roman emperors had been practicing since Augustus, as literal belief. As the genuine, internally held, structurally organizing conviction that the man who had been born Marcus Aurelius Commodus Antoninus was, in some essential and not merely metaphorical sense, the living embodiment of the divine hero, the son of Jupiter, the defeater of monsters, the figure whose mythological function was to impose order on a chaotic world through the application of overwhelming and divinely sanctioned force. He renamed himself Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus Hercules. He appeared in public wearing a lion's skin, Not occasionally, not in the specific ceremonial contexts where symbolic costuming might be read as ritual rather than delusion, but regularly, consistently, as a standard element of his imperial presentation. He carried a club. He commissioned statues of himself as Hercules, not one or two, but dozens, eventually hundreds, distributed through the empire with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that physical representation in stone and bronze was the most durable form of the reality he was trying to establish. He renamed Rome, the city that had existed under its own name for nearly 1,000 years. He renamed it Commodiana, the Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months of the calendar, all 12 of them: Amazonius, Invictus, Felix, Pius, Lucius, Aelius, Aurelius, Commodus, Augustus, Herculeus, Romanus, Ex Superatorius. 12 months, 12 different facets of the identity of the man who had decided that the calendar itself should be organized around him. Marcus Aurelius had written about ego with a precision and a consistency that suggests he understood it as the primary threat to everything he was trying to build in himself. Not ego in the colloquial sense of arrogance or self-importance, but ego in the deeper and more structurally significant sense of the self that needs to be protected, confirmed, expanded, and defended, rather than the self that can afford to be honest because it has been built on something that does not require external confirmation to remain stable. Every human being has this ego. It is not a pathology. It is a structural feature of consciousness, part of the basic psychological equipment that every person carries. The question is not whether it operates, but whether there is something else operating alongside it, something built through the deliberate and costly practice of honest self-examination that can notice when the ego's distortions are producing an increasingly unreliable map of reality and choose, again and again, the discomfort of accuracy over the comfort of confirmation. Marcus Aurelius had spent his entire adult life building that something else. Commodus had built nothing alongside the ego, had been formed in conditions specifically designed to confirm and expand it, had been protected from every experience that might have required him to develop the capacity to notice and correct its distortions. And now, with the paranoia of the post-assassination attempt years having progressively eliminated every person and every institutional structure capable of providing the friction of honest external reality, the ego had no ceiling. Literally, no ceiling. No external limit, no institutional constraint, no individual voice capable of saying and surviving the saying that the map had become unrecognizably disconnected from the territory. The world Commodus was living in was, by this point, almost entirely a construction of what he needed it to be, and what he needed it to be. What the ego, operating without constraint or correction, needed it to be was a world in which he was not just powerful but divine, not just the emperor of Rome, but the living embodiment of the heroic principle that Rome's mythological self-understanding depended on. The arena was where this self-conception found its most visible and most regularly performed expression. Commodus fought as a gladiator. He fought hundreds of times. He trained with genuine dedication. He developed real physical skill, but he did not fight human opponents who had been instructed to lose. He fought animals that had been wounded, hobbled, confined to small enclosures, or otherwise compromised in ways that guaranteed the outcome while maintaining the appearance of genuine danger. Lions that could not run. Bears that had been partially disabled. Ostriches. He killed ostriches, decapitating them with crescent-headed arrows, and then walked through the arena holding the severed head toward the section where the senators were seated, in what everyone present understood as an unmistakable communication about the relationship between the man in the arena and the men in the seats. The senators laughed. The sources record this. that the senators responded to the display with laughter and then immediately explained why. They were terrified. The laughter was the involuntary, survival-driven response of people who understood that their reaction was being watched and that the honest reaction was not an option they could safely choose. So they laughed, and in that laughter, in that specific and deeply human capitulation to the reality that honest response had become too dangerous to risk, the final dissolution of the boundary between the real and the theatrical was being performed. The boundary that Marcus Aurelius had spent his entire life working to maintain. He fought in the arena 735 times. That number, preserved in the historical record with a specificity that suggests someone was actually counting, possibly Commodus himself, represents a commitment that goes so far beyond symbolic or occasional performance that it demands to be understood as something more than political theater. 735 appearances in the arena. 735 occasions on which the Emperor of Rome descended from the imperial box into the sand, dressed in the costume of the divine hero, and performed the ritual of combat against opponents who understood that their survival depended on falling at the right moment. 735 guaranteed victories, each one confirming in the most public and most ritually significant space that Roman civilization had produced, that the self-conception Commodus had built, Hercules, son of Jupiter, defeater of chaos, was real. But the arena was not the only theater in which this erosion was occurring. There was another theater, less visible, less dramatically legible, but in many ways more consequential in its long-term effects on the institutional fabric of Roman governance. The theater of administration, of the daily, unglamorous, structurally essential work of actually running an empire. Commodus did not do this work, not in the way that it needed to be done. He attended to it intermittently, in the way that a man attends to obligations he finds tedious and whose real importance he has never fully understood. The gap was filled by others, by the men who surrounded him, whose own power derived entirely from their proximity to imperial authority and whose management of that authority, in the absence of genuine imperial engagement, became progressively less about serving the emperor's actual interests and more about serving their own. The consequences were visible in ways that Romans who were paying attention could observe and measure. Provincial governance deteriorated. Military readiness eroded at the margins. The judicial system became a tool of the paranoia rather than a mechanism of genuine justice. The treasury began to feel the effects. The fiscal discipline that had characterized the Antonine dynasty began to give way under the combined pressure of Commodus's personal extravagance and the administrative deterioration that his absence from genuine governance was producing. The people of Rome felt these effects in the specific and mundane ways that institutional deterioration always makes itself felt. In justice delayed or denied, in roads less well maintained, in grain distributions less reliable, in the slow, almost imperceptible, but cumulatively significant degradation of the quality and reliability of the governmental services that an empire of Rome's ambition had committed to providing. They felt it, and the awareness, not yet articulated, not yet organized into the political form that would eventually and inevitably need to find expression, accumulated. That something was wrong, that the world they were living in was not functioning the way the world was supposed to function, that the gap between what the empire promised and what it was delivering had been widening for years without anyone at the center seeming to notice or care. Commodus noticed nothing outside the arena. The arena was where reality lived, the only space in his world that provided, with the mechanical reliability of a system designed to produce a specific output, the experience of being exactly who he had decided he was. Until the people who could see it most clearly, the people whose position inside the imperial machinery gave them the most accurate and most comprehensive view of exactly how unsustainable the situation had become, began in the careful and indirect and deeply dangerous way that such conversations are always conducted when the wrong word can produce the wrong consequence, to talk about it. Not in the Colosseum, not in the public spaces where the performance of enthusiasm was still being maintained, but in the private rooms, the inner chambers, the spaces that were, for the moment, still safe enough for honest speech. And what they were saying, what the people closest to Commodus, the people whose lives were most directly bound to his survival, what they were saying to each other in those rooms, in those conversations, was something that had become, by this point, not just thinkable, but necessary. That something had to change, not the performance, the performer. Conspiracies against power do not begin with a decision. That is the first thing that the popular imagination of political conspiracy tends to get wrong. The image of a specific moment, a specific meeting, a specific night when specific people gathered in a specific room and made the specific choice that set everything in motion. Real conspiracies against power begin with a feeling, with the slow, private, individually experienced accumulation of a specific kind of awareness, the awareness that the situation has become incompatible with survival, not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, in the daily lived experience of people whose position inside a system gives them the most accurate and most uncomfortable view of exactly how unsustainable that system has become. It begins with a look exchanged across a room, with a sentence left unfinished because the room is not safe enough to finish it, with the specific quality of silence that falls between two people who have just understood, without saying it, that they have understood the same thing. With the accumulation of those looks and those silences and those unfinished sentences until the weight of what is not being said becomes heavier than the risk of saying it, until the calculation shifts, slowly and then decisively, from the question of whether speaking is safe to the question of whether continued silence is survivable. This is how the conspiracy against Commodus began, not in a dramatic meeting, not with a declaration of intent or a formal agreement, but in the gradual convergence of three people who had spent years inside the most intimate proximity to imperial power, who had seen what that proximity revealed about the man at its center, and who had arrived independently through different routes at different moments, with different specific calculations at the same destination, that the world would be better without him. The three people were Marcia, Ecletus, and Latus. Marcia was his concubine. She was, by the testimony of the sources that describe her with any degree of specificity, a woman of genuine intelligence and genuine influence, whose access to Commodus in his most private and most unguarded moments gave her a quality of knowledge about him that no political relationship and no institutional position could have provided. She had been with him for years, had navigated the specific and perpetually precarious terrain of intimate proximity to a man whose psychological instability made every relationship in his orbit structurally dangerous. She had performed that maintenance with sufficient skill to survive where others had not. But survival had a cost, and the cost, accumulated across years of intimate witness to what Commodus was and what he was doing to Rome, had produced in her something that her position had not been designed to produce. Clarity. The specific and irrevocable clarity of someone who has seen the thing without the filters that distance and ideology and the ordinary human preference for comfortable narratives tend to provide. She had also, at some point in the years before the conspiracy, become a Christian, or at least a sympathizer with Christianity, which in the Roman context of the late 2nd century was a distinction without enormous practical significance. This detail matters not as a theological statement but as a psychological one, as evidence that Marcia had found, outside the imperial world that had organized her entire existence, a framework of values and a community of meaning that was not dependent on Commodus for its content. That she had, in other words, a self that existed beyond the role. Ecletus was the cubicularius, the chamberlain, the man who controlled physical access to the emperor's private spaces. In practical terms, he was the person through whom the outside world reached Commodus and through whom Commodus reached the outside world. He knew who came and went. He knew what was said and to whom. He knew, with a comprehensiveness that no other position in the imperial structure could have provided, the actual texture of how the reign was functioning. Not the official version, not the performed version, but the version visible only from the position of the person managing the practical mechanics of its daily operation. What Ecletus had been managing for years was the progressive deterioration of those mechanics. The increasing frequency with which the emperor's paranoid suspicions required him to facilitate outcomes that his own judgment would have assessed differently. The growing impossibility of maintaining the basic organizational coherence that functional governance requires when the man at the center of the organization was making decisions based on fear and ego rather than on any rational assessment of institutional reality. Latus was the Praetorian prefect, the commander of the guard, the man whose institutional function was, in its most basic description, the exact opposite of what he was about to do. His job was to protect the emperor. But the Praetorian Guard was not, in its own self-understanding, organized simply to protect the physical person of whoever happened to be occupying the throne at a given moment. It was organized to protect Rome, to protect the imperial institution, to protect the thing that the emperor was supposed to embody and serve, rather than the thing that the emperor, in his worst incarnations, simply was. Latus had arrived at the judgment that in the case of Commodus, the person and the institution had become so completely opposed that protecting one required eliminating the other. The three of them found each other gradually. Not in a single dramatic moment of mutual revelation, but in the way that people whose private calculations have reached the same destination find each other. Through the accumulation of small signals, the careful testing of what the other person is willing to hear, the progressive expansion of honest speech in the space between two people who have understood that the other person is safe enough to speak honestly to. What crystallized the conspiracy into action was a list Commodus had been composing in the final weeks of 192 AD, a list of people he intended to execute in the new year. What made this particular list different? What transformed it from another episode of imperial paranoia into the specific and urgent catalyst that converted the three conspirators' shared recognition into immediate action was whose names were on it. Marcia's name was on it. Ecletus's name was on it. Latus's name was on it. The most commonly cited version of events involves a slave, a child named Commodus, who served in the imperial chambers and who, with the specific and completely unself-conscious honesty of a child who does not yet understand the full implications of what he has found, showed Marcia the wax tablet on which the list was written after Commodus had left it somewhere it should not have been left. Marcia read her name, she read Ecletus's name, she read Latus's name. And in that moment, in the specific and irreversible instant of seeing the physical evidence that the calculation she had been making in private had just become a matter of survival rather than preference, the conspiracy stopped being a shared recognition and became a plan. The plan was not complicated. Marcia would administer poison. She put it in his food or in his wine. What the sources agree on is that she administered it, that Commodus consumed it, and that the effects began to manifest within a time frame consistent with the action of the substance involved. He became ill, visibly, seriously ill. but not dying at the speed that the situation required. His body, the body of a man who had spent years in the specific and rigorous physical conditioning of genuine athletic training, was fighting, was processing, was doing with the mechanical indifference of a biological system that has no awareness of the political implications of its own survival, what bodies under chemical assault do, attempting to survive. The conspirators made the decision that the poison alone was not going to be sufficient, and they sent for Narcissus. Narcissus was Commodus's personal wrestling partner, the man he trained with in the private sessions that were among the few genuinely physical activities of his daily life that were not performed for a public audience. A man whose presence in the emperor's inner world represented genuine physical proximity, genuine bodily contact, the intimate and trust-dependent relationship of two people who had spent years in the specific closeness of athletic training. A man who could enter the imperial bath chambers on a night when the emperor was incapacitated by illness without triggering the alarm that any unfamiliar presence would have produced. Narcissus entered. What followed was not dramatic in the way that the death of emperors tends to be dramatized by the historical imagination. It was simply the end of a specific human life in a bath on the last night of the year, administered by the hands of a man who had been chosen for the task because his access was reliable and his physical capability was not in question, and the situation had arrived at a point where the only remaining variable was whether the thing got done. It got done. The body of Commodus needed to leave the palace before the normal institutional functioning of the imperial household resumed. The death needed a cause, a natural cause. They settled on apoplexy, a stroke. The sudden and medically plausible failure of a body that had been, by the evidence available to anyone who had observed Commodus in recent months, under the specific kind of physical and psychological stress that could reasonably produce such an outcome. Pertinax was informed. The man the conspirators had identified as the appropriate successor, the senator and military commander whose character and competence they had assessed as sufficient for the role that the morning was about to require him to fill, was woken in the early hours of January 1st, 193 AD, and told what had happened and what was being proposed. He accepted. The Senate was informed in the morning with the official account of Commodus's death by apoplexy, and the presentation of Pertinax as the new emperor awaiting their confirmation. The Senate confirmed, with a speed and a unanimity that the sources describe in ways suggesting that the confirmation was less the result of deliberation than the expression of a collective relief so profound and so long suppressed that it required no deliberation at all. They confirmed, and then they voted the damnatio memoriae, the official condemnation of Commodus's memory, the formal erasure of his name from the public record of Rome, with the same unanimity and the same absence of genuine debate. And Rome woke up on January 1st, 193 AD, to a world that was different in a way it had not yet fully absorbed. The removal did not undo 12 years. The damage to the Senate's institutional confidence did not disappear. The deterioration of provincial governance and military readiness and fiscal discipline did not reverse itself. The erosion of the shared agreement about reality, the corrosion of the infrastructure of honest speech and genuine accountability that Marcus Aurelius had maintained and that Commodus had systematically destroyed, was not repaired by the morning of January 1st. Pertinax would last 86 days. He would be killed by the Praetorian Guard, the same guard that had facilitated his accession. The year of 5 emperors would follow. The Severan dynasty would eventually emerge from that chaos. The world that Marcus Aurelius had built, the world of philosopher-emperors, of the careful balance between Senate and throne, of the deliberate and effortful maintenance of an imperial authority grounded in something more than military force and personal terror, did not survive Commodus. But the meditations survived. The private diary that Marcus Aurelius had written for no one, in the cold tents on the Danube frontier, in the sleepless nights of the plague years, in the quiet and unglamorous and daily practice of a man holding himself accountable to the version of himself he had decided to be, survived. Was preserved through the specific and somewhat mysterious chain of custody that the historical record does not fully account for into the centuries that followed, was copied and copied again, and eventually printed and eventually translated into every language that the Western tradition produces people who ask the questions that the meditations were written to address. The question survived. The question that Marcus Aurelius asked himself every night survived the man who asked it, and the empire he governed, and the son who destroyed what he built, and the centuries of institutional and political change that followed all of it. And the contrast survived. The specific and permanent and completely legible contrast between the father and the son, between the man who had everything and chose to examine himself and the man who had everything and chose to perform himself, between the reign that ended with a senate in genuine mourning and the reign that ended with a senate in genuine relief. Now there is a question that this entire story has been building toward. Not the historical questions. Not the questions about dates and sources and specific details. Those questions have answers. The question this story has been building toward is simpler than any of those, more direct, more uncomfortable in the specific way that only questions about your own life can be uncomfortable, because they do not permit the comfortable distance of historical analysis or the protective abstraction of philosophical discourse. The question is this: when the people closest to you, the people who have the most accurate and most comprehensive knowledge of who you actually are, beneath the performance you present to the world and the narrative you maintain about yourself, when those people make their private assessment of the distance between the person you present and the person they actually know, what do they find? Not what you hope they find, but what they actually find. This is the question that Commodus never asked, not because he was incapable of formulating it, but because the asking of it would have required confronting an answer that the entire architecture of his psychology had been organized from the beginning to prevent him from having to confront. The gap is universal. It exists in every human being who has ever been honest enough to notice it. It exists in the space between the self that is presented to the world and the self that exists in the silence. In the 3 in the morning moments. In the private reckonings that happen in the space between waking and sleeping, when the ordinary social machinery of self-presentation is temporarily offline and what remains is simply the actual person, with the actual history of actual choices, confronting the actual distance between who they are and who they said they were going to be. Every human being knows this space. Marcus Aurelius called that sensation the signal, the evidence that the gap had widened, that the distance between the examined self and the actual self had increased in ways that required attention. He treated it not as a source of shame, not as evidence of fundamental unworthiness. He treated it as information, as the most valuable kind of information available, the kind that comes from honest internal observation rather than from the curated external feedback of people whose relationship with you includes incentives to provide comfortable assessment rather than accurate assessment. He wrote about it every night, in the specific and unglamorous and perpetually incomplete practice of a man who had understood that the gap does not close permanently, does not reach a destination beyond which the maintenance of its closure is no longer required. The gap requires daily attention, daily recommitment, the daily choice made in the face of the daily temptation to accommodate it rather than address it, to look at it honestly and to do the next available thing that moves toward closing it rather than widening it. That is the practice. This is what Commodus refused, what the entire architecture of his life was organized to avoid. Not just the practice, but the acknowledgement that the practice was necessary. The refusal, sustained across an entire lifetime at enormous cost to everyone within reach of it. To admit that the gap existed, to look at it directly, to sit with the discomfort of what honest looking would reveal and choose, from within that discomfort, to begin the work of addressing it. The refusal is understandable, not excusable. The costs it produced were real, and the people who paid them did not choose to pay them. But understandable in the specific and humanly honest way that the most destructive choices tend to be understandable when examined from within the psychology that produced them, rather than judged from the comfortable distance of a position that does not share that psychology's specific vulnerabilities. Because the gap is uncomfortable. The honest acknowledgement of it is uncomfortable. The sustained practice of looking at it without the protective filters of self-justification and motivated reasoning, that practice is uncomfortable in a way that is not temporary, not something that resolves into comfort once a certain threshold of honest self-examination has been crossed. The discomfort is built into the practice, is, in some fundamental sense, the practice itself. Marcus Aurelius chose the discomfort every night for decades. Not because he had been formed in conditions that made the choice easy. The meditations make abundantly clear that it was never easy. He chose it because he understood, had arrived at the understanding through philosophy and through experience, and through the specific and irreplaceable education of a life lived under conditions that had tested every principle he held against the hardest available reality. That the alternative was not actually more comfortable than it appeared. That the comfort of avoided self-knowledge was not real comfort, but the temporary anesthesia of a wound that, left unaddressed, would expand rather than heal. That the gap, if not worked on, did not remain stable. It grew, widened with each accommodation, each avoidance, each choice to perform rather than examine. Widened until the distance between the performed self and the actual self was large enough to require the full machinery of an empire's enforced participation to sustain the performance, until the people closest to you sent a wrestler to the bath. The difference between those two deaths is the entire lesson. Not the philosophical concepts, not the historical analysis, not the specific and recoverable details of the events that produced them, but the simple, direct, completely unambiguous difference between arriving at the end of your life being the person you decided to be, and arriving at the end of your life as the person that the avoidance of that decision, sustained across decades, had made you instead. That difference is what the story of Marcus Aurelius and Commodus is actually about. Not Rome, not the 2nd century, not the specific institutional arrangements that one preserved and the other destroyed. The gap, what you do with it, and what it does with you if you choose to do nothing. The mirror is here. It has been here for 2,000 years. The only question is whether you are willing to look into it. Now you made it to the end. Not everyone does. Most people pass through content the way they pass through everything else the modern world offers in abundance. Quickly, partially, always half somewhere else, always half present. Consuming without being consumed by. Watching without being changed by. Moving to the next thing before the current thing has had the time to do what only the things that matter can do. Settle. Land. Ask something real of the person who encountered them. You stayed. From the bath on December 31st to the mirror at the end. Through Marcus Aurelius and the warning he wrote but couldn't act on. Through the boy born inside the purple who never had to earn anything. Through the 16-year-old who showed exactly who he would become. Through the assassination attempt that broke something that was never fully whole. Through Hercules and the renamed months and the senators laughing at severed heads. through the conspiracy that grew in silence between three people who had finally calculated that silence was no longer survivable, through the night that Rome had been waiting for in quiet for years. You stayed through all of it. And if something in this story landed, if at any point you felt that specific sensation of a historical narrative speaking about something closer to your own life than ancient history has any right to be, if you recognized the gap, if you felt the weight of the mirror and the discomfort of what honest looking into it reveals, then what you felt was real, and it deserves to be acknowledged rather than scrolled past. So before you go, I need to ask you three things. The first, go to the comments right now and write, "I am looking into the mirror," not as performance, not as the kind of reflexive engagement that content asks for and that most people provide without any genuine connection to what they are expressing, but as the specific and intentional act of a person who has just spent 2 hours with a story about the cost of avoiding honest self-examination and who is choosing in this moment to do the opposite of what Commodus chose, to look, to acknowledge the gap, to say publicly, to yourself as much as to anyone reading, that you are aware of the distance between who you are and who you decided to be, and that you are choosing to do something about it rather than performing it away. When you write that in the comments, you are not just engaging with the video, you are doing something that Marcus Aurelius would recognize, making the private commitment public enough that it asks something of you. Making yourself accountable to the version of yourself that this story pointed toward. Creating in the specific and small and completely real way that small acts of public commitment create, a thread between who you are today and who you decided to be. Write it. I am looking into the mirror. It is 3 words. It is also, if you mean it, the beginning of the only work that this story suggests is actually worth doing. The second, hit the like button. Right now, before you forget, before the next thing pulls your attention elsewhere, and this video becomes one more thing you meant to engage with and didn't. Not for the number, but because the like is your signature. Your way of saying that this kind of content, real history, real psychology, real questions about character and power, and the gap that exists inside every human life between who it is and who it decided to be, has value. That depth has value. That the time you just spent with a story that asked something real of you was worth the investment. Hit it. Now. The third, if you are not yet subscribed to Mindmasters Academy, subscribe right now and activate the bell. Not out of habit, but because what is being built on this channel is a series, a deliberate and connected sequence of stories about the minds and lives and decisions that most shaped how human beings understand power, character, and themselves. Each video is a piece, and the pieces connect in ways that only become fully visible to the people who follow the entire sequence. You just finished a piece that began with Socrates, that passed through Aristotle, that arrived at Marcus Aurelius and at Commodus, who is what happens when the work that Socrates and Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius dedicated their lives to is refused. You have been building, across this series, an understanding of something that no single video and no single story can deliver alone. An understanding of the relationship between genuine self-knowledge and genuine power, between the examined life and the life that the examination makes possible, between the work that Marcus Aurelius did every night in the silence of a military tent and the world he was able to build because of it. That understanding is not complete. It requires the full sequence. Subscribe. Activate the bell. Stay for what comes next. Because what comes next, the video that is on the screen right now, waiting for you to click it, is the story that this entire series has been building toward without announcing it. For 1,700 years, history condemned one man as the greatest traitor who ever lived, built an entire civilization's moral architecture in part around the symbol of his betrayal, used his name as the definition of what it means to sell out the people who trusted you, for 30 pieces of silver, for personal gain, for the small and shameful calculation of a man whose character was insufficient for the loyalty the situation required. And then in 1978, in a cave in Egypt, archaeologists found a document that had been buried, systematically destroyed, officially declared heretical and erased from the historical record for 17 centuries by the most powerful institution in Western history. And what it says about Judas Iscariot, about what actually happened, about what the man history made into the symbol of betrayal was actually doing, and why and at whose request, will permanently change how you think about loyalty, power, narrative, and the people who write the version of history that the rest of us inherit as truth. The document survived. The question it raises did not survive by accident. Click the next video. It is on the screen right now.